Good morning. Pleasure to be back and let's just jump in. We'll get to this sheet, the handout that's here, but this is Parshat Hayei Sarah, but you know that already. I'm going to use a slightly different Chumash than you have. Yeah. Oh. So let's just look at that. In Eitz Chaim. Say it again.
1, 2, 7.
120. Well, that's how old she was when she died. Did you telling me that's the page also? Oh, isn't that clever? I never knew that. Eitz Chaim. It opens Sarah's lifespan. Sarah's lifetime. The span of Sarah's life came to 127 years.
It's so hard to coordinate.
And I'm telling you, they had to reconfigure. See, if I had not heard that out loud, I never would have gotten it. Moses was Abraham. I knew somebody was going to ask me that this morning, but I still didn't bother to look it up. I forget if it was 180 or 160, something. Yeah.
21.
So, yeah, because remember, it's actually in this parsha, we're not really going to spend time focusing on it, but in this parsha, after Sarah dies, Abraham remarries. He's already, I mean, I got in trouble once when I was teaching at Menorah Park used to have something called the Rose Institute, where they ran in-house classes, and I would teach there, and I was doing a 3 or 4 part series on largely ignored but important Jewish women. And so one of the sessions was devoted to the biography of Harriet Zold. Henrietta Zold. Henrietta Zold. And a name that probably many of you are familiar with. She created Hadassah, which is for many years, I don't know if it still is, but for many years was not only the largest Jewish women's organization, it was the largest Jewish organization in the world. Right, and I know. And she never married. She had an unrequited love and she never married. And at one point in the biography, I described her as an old woman. And the group of women at the Rose Institute, one of them came after me and said, well, she at the time in her life you're describing, she was younger than all of us in the room. So I'm very careful, but by any definition, Abraham, after Sarah dies, he's an old man. And but that doesn't stop him from remarrying.
Somewhere that the ages were actually at least cut in half because each season was considered a year.
Well, let me comment on that because I was going to do that in 10 minutes. So let me do it now. For those of you that have studied with me, although I guess most of you have last time I was here, but one of my cardinal rules of Torah and Bible study is that I trust none of the ages and numbers in the Bible. They simply are not believable. They all have other meaning. Let me address the age issue. So the word that's often used, as it is here, is Shana, which we know to be, like from Rosh Hashanah, a year, right? But better, Shana should be probably translated as something like cycle. Because after all, what's a year do? It starts, you go through it, and then you come back to the beginning. It's a new year, fair enough, but then you come around and it's some kind of cycle. So many people have proposed that the cycle they're talking about was either half or maybe a cycle was a season. But even if you accept any of those arguments, a season would require you to divide the number by 4, right? Even if you accept any of those arguments or theories or conjectures, because that's really what they are, there is no single system that works for the Torah and the Bible. But let's just focus on Torah. So we don't know, and different stories, the cycle, the number of cycles or years, they're not consistent. And how can I demonstrate this to you? we don't really know how old Moses was when he died, but if you read the description of his death, it's at the end of years of leadership. And clearly, he's an elderly gentleman. And if you divide it, you take his 120 years, if you divide it in half, maybe you get close. 60 in that time probably was an older gentleman. If you divide it, but there's no real logic, by the way, to saying it's half. It makes more sense for it to be a season.
Right.
And then that's divided by 4. Then he's 30 years old. Even in antiquity, 30 years old didn't make him an old man, not in the way he's portrayed. So that doesn't work.
Here either.
So, well, that's you can only get me so far off track. So it doesn't work. And take the oldest man in the Bible. Who's the oldest man? He's in the Torah. Methuselah lives to be how old? 900, I think it's 69, if I remember correctly. So what do you divide that by to make it work? In other words, so you can't trust any of the ages. It's trying to tell us in the Moses story, he was an old man. Abraham was an old man. Sarah was an older woman, right? Similarly, and the genealogies are suspect and the numbers are suspect. 600,000 Israelites coming out of Egypt. And I know there are Jews. Rabbi David Wolpe, one of the great rabbis in this country, gave a sermon a number of years ago on
I think it was 900 years ago.
on Passover, thank you. On Passover, gave a sermon about the myth of the Exodus. Now, he is a brilliant rabbi. I just watched a video clip of him. It wasn't such a clip. He did at I forget which conference, he moderated a panel with 2 other rabbis about it was a depressing panel, as so many of these things are these days, about kind of the state of American Judaism and vis-a-vis anti-Semitism. So even a brilliant guy can make a devastating mistake. And he gave this and he did it Passover morning. Now, I thought to myself when I heard that, yeah, but Passover morning's not that many people in shul, so, on one hand, if he has to pick a day to do it, better then than on Yom Kippur. But about the myth of so I know there are people, and he wasn't entirely wrong, who question whether we actually came out of Egypt. Like it or not, for better or worse, I'm one of those people believe maybe the Torah doesn't get every individual. It's not a newspaper account of what happened, but I'm one of those people who believes the Exodus did happen and we were enslaved and we did come out. So I take a little issue with his sermon, but he had his own problems when he gave it, so he didn't need my aggravation. 600,000 Israelites coming out of Egypt, but that is defined in that story as men of military age. So that means it was all the men 18 or 20 and older. So if you had 600,000 men, you have to have approximately, because this is how it works in the world, 600,000 women. And with that many men and women, you had to have a whole bunch of kids. You're looking at a population coming out of Egypt of at minimum 1.5 to 2 million people. There is no demographer of the ancient world who believes that a community of 2 million people, by the way, it says not all the slaves left, right? Not all the Israelites left. So now you're talking about a Jewish community of 2+ million. 3,200 years ago, it's not possible. So I'm suspect. It doesn't mean I don't respect the Torah. It doesn't mean I don't get something out of it. What is the 600,000 trying to tell us? It was a huge number, right? And you try and get 4 Jews to move in the same direction. It's not easy to do. 600,000, Moses had to work on. So my general principle is ages, numbers, genealogies, they're all suspect. You can accept that or not, but that's my approach. Now, let's go to the text. Chapter 23. Wait, I'm stirring up trouble, yes. Right.
It's obviously said that the length of life has been increasing evolutionarily and not decreasing.
Well, sure.
If we live now to be 80, 90, or 100, you can imagine that then they could not live 80.
Right. No, even today, Al Roker used to honor 100-year-olds, but they had to stop doing it because it went from being, you know, 1 or 2 a week to hundreds every day. So, right, we know that's the case. And listen, you know, the Torah is telling a story. As I said, it's not a newspaper account. I do this with my bar and bat mitzvah students. This is a great time of year to do it. Take a leaf that's fallen off of a tree. I tell the kids, take that leaf and take it into school and show it to your science teacher and say, describe this leaf to me. And the science teacher will describe the leaf, the shape of the leaf, the capillary action of the leaf, why the whole thing with chlorophyll and photosynthesis and why the leaf changes color and falls from the tree. And you'll get a very good description of the leaf. And now take that same leaf to the art teacher and say, describe this leaf. And the art teacher will describe the shape and the shading and the shadows it creates. On one side is glossy and the other side is dull. And I say to them, which one is wrong? They gave you 2 different descriptions. Which one is wrong? And the answer is, of course, as you already know, neither one. They're both right. They're looking at it through different eyes. The Torah is not a journalistic, historical newspaper account of what happened. It's telling a story from a religious, theological, spiritual perspective, whatever word you want to attach to it. And so from that perspective, it's absolutely correct, right? But it's not an accurate history like we would expect a history today, right? It's not a book of science. To me, what's amazing is not the differences between the scientific idea of the creation of the world, of the Big Bang and then evolution, right? And the biblical view, how different they are. What's much more interesting to me is the amount of overlap that there is. Because our ancestors, I would never describe them as, you know, silly or dumb or naive, but this they were. They were pre-scientific. I mean, that can't be argued. They were pre-scientific. And so their description is going to have a certain bent to it. To me, it's amazing how much overlap there is between the scientific view and the biblical view. Okay, now we go to chapter 23 of Genesis. That was a long introduction. And this Eitz Chaim translation, I want to object to right from the beginning. Vayiyu Chaye Sarah, and it was the life of Sarah, Mea Shana, 100 Shana, Ve'esrim Shana, and 20 Shana, Ve'sheva Shanim, and 7 Shana. Shanim, the plural of Shana, right? It's an irregular plural. She was 120 and 7. That is an odd way to say somebody's age. If I ask you how old you are, you don't say, you know, I'm gonna get in trouble here. I'm 50 plus 2, right? You say I'm 52. So this is you know, anytime you have this kind of odd linguistic formation, right? Not quite grammar here, but odd. It's just an odd prose part of the narrative. That cries out darsheni, right? Make a midrash on me. Explain to me what this means. And I just want to go over this quickly because this is a lovely midrash and it's also quite sexist in my opinion. And it says that she had the wisdom of a 100-year-old and the beauty of a 20-year-old and the childlike innocence of a 7-year-old.
That is just too far-fetched.
I told you I wasn't going to spend time on it, but that's where it begins. Now, and then Sarah, and of course the irony in this is that Chaye Sarah, the life of Sarah, begins with her death, right? So we can't help but notice that. Now, you can't study and read this portion without knowing and spending some time with what happened immediately prior to this. And what happened immediately prior to this, last week's Parsha, Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. And because there is no interaction between Sarah and Abraham, when he goes, because he gets up early in the morning, saddles his own donkey. By the way, you know, I don't know, who taught you last week?
Shine.
Jeffrey Shine? No, Stacy Schlein.
Stacy.
Yeah, Jeffrey Shine had to move out of town so that Stacy Schlein could move here. Not like this synagogue where you have to apparently be named Josh Rosenbaum to be on the clergy staff here. It's very confusing. I still don't know who's who. But right, I am glad that over the years, your senior rabbi, Hal, no longer looks younger than the bar mitzvah boys. Finally, he crossed that threshold. When he first came to town, honest to God, you could not tell the difference. Wait, who's on the beamer? Which one's the bar mitzvah? Which is the rabbi? There, he leaves early in the morning, and that's what I was gonna say. And it says, Vayashkem Abraham baboker, Vayachavoshet chamoro, and he saddled his own donkey. So two things from that story, maybe Stacy, Rabbi Schlein mentioned it. One, whenever the Torah says somebody woke up early in the morning, it's a way of telling us they were eager to fulfill the mitzvah. Right? We still do that if we're eager to do something, we get up early, right? Unless it's a flight that we don't want to go on, but it's at 6 a.m. We got to get to the airport at 4:30. He was eager to do it, and he saddled his own donkey. And again, the Midrash says, whenever a person of renown does a menial task, again, it indicates their zealousness, right? Their true desire to do this. Yes.
Can you comment on the last three words of verse, right? Nay, and yes, about the number, then at the end it said, the years of the life of Sarah.
I'll only offer this comment, then we're gonna keep going, which the Midrash says, it puts that phrase in there specifically to tell us that all of her years were good years. That's anything so neat and clean like that, I'm always a little suspect, but the Midrash addresses that, because it is a curiosity. But Abraham wakes up early, saddles his own donkey, doesn't communicate with Sarah that he's taking their son. He just goes and does it. This idea, by the way, of the husband leaving the house without telling his wife where he's going or what he's doing, that's familiar to many of us. That part is the most believable part of that whole story. My wife had to teach me, actually, a friend of my wife's had to teach me that when she texts me, no response is not acceptable. You have to acknowledge the text somehow. So I said, oh, I get it. So then I would text her back, K, for okay. This is really what my wife's friend taught me. K is also unacceptable. So it's hey, so this is the way men are, right? So he leaves, and the whole story happens, and and listen, it's a happy ending in the sense that he doesn't sacrifice his son. But we're gonna get to this in one of the poems we're gonna look at. But it's a horrible story. I mean, the Akedah is the most, it's not just my opinion, many people have said this. I'm quoting, hundreds of other rabbis and other people who study Torah. It's the most horrific, difficult, challenging, upsetting story in the entire Torah. And there's more midrash on the Akedah than on any other single story in the Torah. I mean, the whole volumes have been written, right? Because he doesn't wind up sacrificing him, but imagine he binds his son to the altar. Isaac looking up at him as his father ties him to the wood that Isaac himself carried. That is to say that Abraham had Isaac carry. I mean, they don't make the guy that's going to stand in front of a firing squad bring all the rifles to the fire. It's a terrible story. And what happens next? Sarah dies, and the Midrash connects the two and says she didn't know what was going on, but she hears word from their encampment what Abraham has taken Isaac to go do, and she drops dead from shock, if you will, right? And in some ways that makes Abraham culpable for her death. In any event, that is why this Chayei Sarah comes immediately after. That's one interpretation of this, right? Others let Abraham off the hook, but in other words, she finds out, and either she knows what he's going to do or she doesn't know the end of the story and she thinks he's actually done it. Remember, this kid Isaac was not an easy kid to come by. I mean, forget about IVF. They had to wait till she was 90 and he was 99. Then they needed angels of God to come, right? I don't know if that's more expensive or less expensive than IVF, but this was not an easy kid to come by. And then he takes it. By the way, in the Akedah, did Rabbi Schlein talk about this? How old? Because the text describes Isaac as a lad, right? He seems to be a young, but how old is Isaac in that story?
37.
37. Again, a reason why I don't believe any of the ages, right? But those who have worked out the genealogies and the ages say he was 37. He's a grown man. So that's a problem. Now, let's go back. Let's go to the sheet you have since we've been talking about it. This is Chaim Gori, is an Israeli poet. I forget if he was born in pre-statehood Palestine or immigrated there, but he was in Israel during and fought in the War of Independence. He was part of a group of poets known as the Palmach poets. These were all poets who were in Israel at the time of independence, fought in the army, went on to become poets, and they wrote poetry basically from the late 40s into the 1960s. And this was the generation of Palmach poets, mostly men, some women. And Chaim Gori was one of them. I don't know too much else about his lifetime. And this is called Heritage. Who will read for us? Yeah, please.
The ram came last of all, and Abraham did not know that it came to answer the boy's question. First of his strength when his day was on the wane. The old man raised his head, seeing that it was no dream and that the angel stood there. The knife slipped from his hand. The boy, released from his bonds, saw his father's back. Isaac, as the story goes, was not sacrificed. He lived for many years, saw what pleasure had to offer until his eyesight dimmed. But he bequeathed that hour to his offspring. They are born with a knife in their hearts.
Tough poem. I want to talk a little bit about it. Of course, it invokes this at the very end, this image, they are born with a knife in their hearts. And for a group of people who came through the War of Independence, right, to establish the state of Israel. So this is their experience and the loss, and it's a hard time to talk about it because we're reliving a piece of it, even as we sit here. This is the knife in our hearts that Jews and those committed to the land of Israel and the state of Israel, that this is what we live with, right? For me, this poem is always connected to another one, and I'm sorry I didn't think to bring it, which is Natan Alterman's Silver Platter, it's called. And Natan Alterman was again one of the Palmach poets, and it's a saga about the death of young soldiers. And they walk off of the battlefield. They're dead, but they walk off of the battlefield, and they say to those assembled, I'm not going to get it quite right, but they say to those assembled, we are the silver platter upon which the state is served. This, in other words, this was the price that the nation paid, right? I mean, this past week, they surpassed 800 soldiers killed in the current war. I mean, and if you look at the names and pictures and ages of these soldiers, some of them are in their 30s and 40s, but most of them are 19 to like 23 years old. I mean, this is the next generation, right? I mean, I'm old enough to say that now, and to just imagine what it is. They're now over 800 soldiers. It's staggering. It's so upsetting. So this is, right, we're born with a knife in our hearts. And in fact, the Midrash says, and he references it, he clearly knew it. A lot of these Palmach poets came out of, even though they themselves either were or became, most of them, very secular Jews. Strong Zionists, right? They were Israelis and strong Zionists and Jewish, but not religious. The idea of sitting around and studying Torah on a Saturday morning is not something they did. They met they found a coffee shop and they met, but but a lot of them came from religious backgrounds and they had studied in either cheder or yeshiva, right? So lots of them knew their Jewish sources. And clearly he does, because there's a midrash that why does Isaac, of all the patriarchs, why does Isaac lose his eyesight? The midrash said it's because when he was bound to the altar, he looked into his father's eyes and couldn't believe what his father was about to do. And it was almost like a hysterical blindness, right? A reaction to the horror he was living in. The same way we know that, right? People that are being abused or worse, they disassociate, right? Emotionally, psychologically. So this was like a physical manifestation of that disassociation. And that's when his vision impairment began, was when he looked at his own father. When he was bound to the altar. I mean, it's a horrific image. Okay. So anybody else want to say anything about heritage? And then we're going to keep moving. There's never enough time to do what we want to do. Yes.
I mean, it's kind of a cynical ending. You know, I mean, last week we talked about, you know, the sacrifice that didn't happen, but that Abraham, the most important part of the Akedah is chapter 22, verse 8. When Abraham answers his son, his question is, you know, you have the wood and the fire, who will provide for the lamb, and Abraham says, God will provide the offering, the lamb for the offering. And that's the line that Isaac will remember for the rest of his life. And it will turn him in ultimately to the son of the covenant, that he will accept the covenant and become the patriarch that he's meant to be. It's that line. And in other words, they reconcile. He forgives his father ultimately. And it's because of the one line, because those are the only words that Abraham speaks to him.
I wouldn't disagree with you. I would only say that for me, that read that they reconciled and he forgave his father, that is what I would call a very gentle reading of the text. In other words, I'm not really comfortable with that. I mean, and that's not in the text itself. That's a midrashic interpretation, which doesn't invalidate it. I'm not invalidating it by saying that, only saying that that's one way of looking at it. But it's just not, I'm not really comfortable with it. I can't imagine that so easily. Not that people never reconcile, they do, but that lets Abraham off a little too easy for my liking. Others may like it, and that's perfectly fine. Yes.
I don't get the inclusion of the first section. I mean, I'm just looking, if I get rid of it, I'm just as happy if it started with the old name as it said. Because we're taught that the ram, Abraham wasn't told, oh, go sacrifice a ram instead. Abraham chose to do that, and it wasn't necessarily, and so I don't really, I don't really get what I'm supposed to be getting out of that first section.
Well, then start with the second paragraph. And I mean, let me relieve you. And yeah, you know, I don't know what to tell you. Chaim Gorin wrote it with the first. But I take your point. Maybe he was just being clever by opening with a line that says came last of all. Maybe that's it. All right, I want to keep going.
Okay.
So this is the only Torah portion named for a woman, by the way. Most of the Torah portion are not named for people. Let's acknowledge that. I think there's only 4 or 5 or 6, something like that. It's only a few. It might only be 4. But this is the only one named with a woman's name in it. And as this is a wonderful commentary, came out a number of years ago, the Torah, a women's commentary put out by the women of Reform Judaism. And I want to give credit where credit is due. Cantor Sarah Sager was one of the driving forces behind the creation and publication of this book. She gave a talk at a Women of Reform Judaism. I don't know if they met every year or every other year. And her talk was about we should create, I don't even know when it was. I think it may have been back in the 70s or 80s. It took a long time. And she said we should have a women's commentary to the Torah. And few other people ran with that idea, really walked pretty slowly with it, but eventually, in whatever year, this has been out for quite a while. And it's got different parshiot are, the commentaries come from different rabbis and scholars, so it makes it a little inconsistent, but it's still a wonderful book. 2008. So this book's been out 16 years now. In the commentary to this week's Parsha, the scholar who wrote the commentary, I forget who it is, it says here, but I don't remember who it is, wrote, women's voices are rarely heard, talking about in the Torah, and we certainly know that's true. Despite the fact that they must have made up 50% of the population of Israelites, that's me writing that, women's thoughts, actions, and experiences are meagerly represented in the Bible. In a Devar Torah I wrote a number of years ago, this led me to the point I've made many times, that I'm sure some of your other Shabbos morning teachers have talked about. This is a curious custom we have where we read over the course of a year the entire Torah, and then at Simchas Torah we roll it back and we start all over again and we do it again. I mean, even a good book that you really like, maybe you read it a second time. If you're a Shakespeare scholar, you read certain parts of Shakespeare over and over again. Fair enough. But for the most part, we don't take a written document, even a good movie that you like. I mean, I've watched Shawshank Redemption, I don't know how many times, right? But I don't watch it every day. I don't go back. So, but we do this. It's a curiosity. And what's curious about it is the Torah text never changes. So why are we reading it over and over again? The obvious answer is that we change, right? We bring new eyes to it. We've all had this experience. I understood some of the stories in Genesis about families and parents and children in a very different way after I had children, right? And so that's why we return to it. The words don't change, but we bring different eyes to it each time, right? And we could come up with 100 examples of that. Okay. Now, what she also goes on, here it is, Meira Schreiber writes that if you look at all the examples in Jewish ancient writings, in Torah and in Bible more generally, and even things that come after that, she writes that throughout antiquity, the lament of mourning she's talking about belonged largely to women who gathered to lead the community in the rites of grief. The act of mourning, she writes, was typically associated with women. And what caught my attention about that is that, like you, I wind up at I make many Shiva visits, and I wind up in many homes where they're sitting Shiva. And I've never really seen a man organize and run the Shiva and the kitchen during the Shiva. It's always the women, right? So in some ways, this persists. And she goes on and she writes more about that. I won't go into all of it, but she writes more about that. And what she goes on to write about is that with the death of Sarah, things are thrown off balance. Because now the woman, right, the matriarch is absent. And what happens? And all of let me say it differently. The stories in Genesis, so many of them are origin stories, and lots of them are family of origin stories, right? And we come to understand how families work or don't work. It describes both family function and dysfunction. And as I tell all of my premarital couples when I meet with them, whatever you grew up with in your family of origin, however wonderful, warm, and loving it was, however crazy, dysfunctional, and nuts it was, that is baseline normal for each of us because it's what we grew up with, right? And a marriage, part of the challenge in a marriage is you bring two baseline normals that are not the same because you can't marry your sister or brother. You bring two baseline normals and, right, we see things very differently. My in-laws had, as my parents did, had a very loving, wonderful marriage. I know my parents argued. They never argued in front of the kids. I really have like two memories of my parents. We knew sometimes mom was pissed at dad, but we didn't hear them argue. My in-laws had a very different take. And they yelled and argued in front of the kids. And when I joined that family, I was 19 when I met my wife. It took me several years to get used to that. In some ways, I actually never got used to it, right? Because it was just so different for us. And I would be totally on edge. And Roxanne was like, she's fine. She's used to it. That's what her parents do. It's how they let off steam, right? It's not right or wrong. It's just different than what I grew up with. So we have that. So now the family is thrown off balance. And of course, we don't know because the Torah says Abraham returns to Beersheba, and we don't know where he's not with him. As much as the Torah emphasizes on the way to the binding of Isaac, the two of them, what does it say? Walk together with one heart, right? Vayachush nehem yachtav, and the two of them walked on together, which the commentary says they were of one heart and one mind and one soul. That's on the way. I think it says that 3 times. On the way back, it doesn't tell, they don't seem to be together. And you can imagine that maybe Isaac didn't want to go back with his father so much. That's why your midrashic interpretation, I'm a suspect of. So they're not together. And we can understand that. Why would you want to walk with your father who just bound you to the altar? Right? My kids want to barely be with me when I'm nice to them, much less. So in this commentary, it includes in the back another poem, and that's the one I want to look at the bottom. By Nessa Rappaport, who's an author. I looked her up a little bit. She's an author. She was born in the early 1950s, so she's got to be around age 70 today. She wrote this in 1994 in a book called A Woman's Book of Grieving, which is not all poems. There's some essays and some meditations, but this is one of them. Undo it, take it back. Make every day the previous one until I am returned to the day before the one that made you gone. Or set me on an airplane traveling west, crossing the date line again and again, losing this day, then that, until the day of loss still lies ahead and you are here instead of sorrow. It's a very beautiful, evocative poem. And of course, as I wrote in my Devar Torah this week, I imagine that when Sarah died, what Abraham was feeling aligns with what Nessa Rappaport has written here, right? This desire. It's one of the most natural things. Even when someone lives a wonderful and long and good life, there's, that doesn't, it may allow us to have the perspective that a death at that point is not tragic, but it's still tremendously sad for the family. And actually what I've discovered over the years, I'm getting to be a rabbi for a long time now, is that in some ways, when a person lives a very long time, they live into their, mid-90s, late 90s and dies, many families have a sense of almost shock. And on the one hand, you want to say to them, how can this take you by surprise? This person was in their 90s. I mean, that's what people in their 90s do, right? We all do eventually, but actually what happens is the person in the family who just died of old age, they have been around for everything. And like Energizer bunnies, right? They had cancer 25 years ago, and then they had something else 15 years ago, and they survived everything. And they kept going, and they've been around for all the family events, all the holidays, all the simchas, all the tzuras. They've been around for, and so it is shocking to imagine, like, all of a sudden this person's not going to be in our reality anymore. We carry them with us for sure, but they're not going to be in the room, right? And it is shocking. Hang on one second, yeah, Ellie.
How does what you just said relate to the kind of mourning, if you will, when we go through Kaddish and Yisker every year? There's still a pain that will in the case of love, always be there. So how do you relate that to what you just said?
So here's what I talk about with people. Because sometimes people say time heals. That is one of those expressions that I don't like at all. It's not the time, because for me, time doesn't heal in the sense that there are moments, and your reference to Yisker, because this has happened to me, to Yisker, made me think of this. There are moments years after a loved one has died where we are again so overcome with grief that it's as real and intense as in the moments when we were first grieving. What does happen over time for most of us, if we can grieve fully and in a healthy way, the instances when we get caught up in that intensity, the length of time between getting so caught up grows longer, right? In the immediate aftermath of death, we feel that all the time, right? That's why in those, the first 6 months of mourning, and for some people longer, I'm just picking 6 months as a kind of arbitrary, you walk around in a daze, in a haze, not in a daze, in a haze. This is why it's so hard to concentrate. This is why sleep is disrupted. And so time doesn't make the intensity go away. We can get caught up there again. And of course, for me, the yard site, the Yisker, multiple times a year, the yard site annually, is a way to acknowledge that loss that we've experienced and help us integrate it into our lives. I mean, that's what we do with grief. We don't get over it, right? There's no circumstance in which we get over it, but we integrate it into our lives and we come to accept it. What might be very hard to accept initially, we eventually can come to accept it. I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but.
Well, actually, what happens, and it happened to Abraham, is he was now in charge. Without Sarah, his son was of no help. And he was somewhat dependent on Sarah for certain things, like the hospitality. And she was now gone, and he didn't have anyone. And from Isaac's point of view, when both parents, or any child, when both parents are gone, you don't have a resource to find out, hey, what happened to such and such? There are questions you suddenly want to ask someone.
And right, and there's
you can't.
nobody to ask.
You are now the source of everything. And you're the old person now. They come to you and you don't have anybody to turn to. So it's a change in status, and Abraham obviously, he got more busy.
Right.
Right.
These are part of.
In my learning and my personal experiences, life and death are intertwined in Judaism.
For sure.
And I have seen this over and over. So it's very interesting. These commentaries in the Torah, yeah, many times
They're not intertwined?
in the sense that, maybe eventually you come to accept.
Yeah.
I just find, me personally, the more I live, the longer I live, they really are, they're really part of each other.
Right. But I have a couple of readings I want to share. I just want to say a couple of things. One of the challenges, since we're on the subject, one of the challenges of grieving and mourning, and I think this gets to some of what you were saying, is that we discover pretty quickly, whatever the circumstances of death are, that on the one hand, we grieve, and we're supposed to grieve fully. The first 3 days of Shiva are called Yemei Bechi, the days of wailing, of weeping. We're supposed to really let it all out, right? And there's an intensity to it. My experience is that for many people, the day of the funeral and burial, the hardest moment of the day, it's a terrible day. the hardest moment of the day is when you have to leave the gravesite. Because at that moment, you're leaving your loved one and you are stepping away. And that's where it's a physical illustration, manifestation is the word I'm looking for. It's a physical manifestation of that your life goes on and your interests are now different than the deceased. And so I tell people, do it gently, do it slowly. You know, Berkowitz human staff will ask if you're ready to go back to the car there. It's not because they're trying to rush you, right? They want to accommodate you, but take whatever time you need, because some people need more time. And that's why families linger at the grave. It's hard to leave that day.
And when they leave at the end of the Shiva, it's even harder because suddenly you don't have any visitors, you know, everybody's
Right,
abandoned.
The time out you've taken, this is why, you know, for lots of us, Shivas have become abbreviated. And now, let me say something about that. Jewish ritual and customs surrounding grief and mourning are among, in my opinion, and the opinion of many others, are among kind of the psychologically healthiest part of Judaism. Physically healthiest too, because for Eastern European Jews, eating all that gribbiness probably wasn't so good for us either. But the rituals of mourning and grief, those are spiritually and psychologically sound. They also develop in a time before we had, for the most part, the extended kinds of death that medicine today often provides. And so when a family has been going through an experience of a lengthy death of a loved one and hospice care for weeks, and I know in a way, they feel like they've done anticipatory grief and they feel like they've been sitting Shiva already before the person died. So I get that. I understand it and I'm sympathetic to it. My concern always, whether it's that circumstance or whatever the circumstance is, if we're going to abbreviate Shiva, I get it. People have lives. It doesn't always fit in with the way we live, so I can live with that. As a rabbi, I can live with that. I wouldn't recommend it, but I can live with it. But what I find disturbing, not because it disturbs me, it doesn't matter for me, but because I feel like people aren't giving themselves what they owe themselves, is when people sit Shiva for an afternoon, right? Or for a few hours, you know, today and tomorrow. And because I feel like they're cheating themselves. Because there is grieving that we do in those first few days that we can only do in those first few days. There's an immediacy to it. And if we don't feel those emotions in that immediate time period, we are cheating ourselves of something. I just had a situation like this recently where in advance of the funeral and in the beginning of a Shiva and so on, the family members, they find things to fight about with one another. And I understand psychologically why they're doing. The pain that they're facing is so difficult that they have to refocus their energy, distract themselves, right? But what I try, if they ask for my help, or I'm bold enough, if I can find a way to insert myself, my kids will tell you, yeah, he never has a problem inserting himself in somebody else's life. If I can insert myself, what I try and help them understand is you're doing this to avoid doing what emotionally you need to be doing right now. And you only get, you know, the first week after the death and burial of a loved one, you only get that first week one time. And after a week, it's gone. Doesn't mean you stop grieving and you can't, of course you do. But there is something to the immediacy of feeling the intensity of that grief that is difficult and very healthy. And so I worry when people cheat themselves. That's my value-laden word. Cheat themselves. Somebody online has a question? Yes.
Yes, Rabbi. Why do we curtail Shiva after a funeral because of a holy day? I could never understand that. It troubles me.
Right. Well, yeah, as much as I say all the rituals of and customs of grief and mourning are so healthy, there are some things built into the system that are problematic. And we've had some deaths in my family, that coincided with or came immediately before a holiday, which abbreviates the Shiva and cuts off the Shiva. I mean, the answer to why is, that's a simple answer, but then I'm gonna give you what I would suggest doing anyway. The simple answer is that we don't, on Shabbos and holidays, mix grieving and celebration of the holiday, in part because grieving is a personal experience and celebration of Shabbat and holiday is a communal public experience. And even in that moment of our grief, our individual needs do not override the needs of the community that we live in. And so we go to services on the Shabbat during Shiva, right? Shabbos during Shiva people don't come to our house to sit Shiva on Shabbos, but it still counts as one of the days, right? And we traditionally go to synagogue. We set aside our grief for a moment. Holidays, of course, do create a cutoff in Shiva. And it's because the grieving and the mourning don't go together. You take off the kriya, if you wear a torn garment or a kriya ribbon, you take it off Friday night before sundown, and if you're resuming Shiva, you put it back on Saturday night after Shabbat ends, right? Because we don't intermingle the grief and the mourning. Now, hang on one second. But what I recommend to families is that they do, if Shiva's cut off because of a holiday, observe the holiday, and then in some kind of informal way, give yourself some time out and observe some kind of Shiva, even if it doesn't necessarily mean that people are coming to visit you and so on. Take some time as an individual, as a family, and in some ways kind of resume an informal, quote unquote, unofficial Shiva. Yes.
Do you have any suggestions to make to well-meaning people who might, during that immediate period you spoke about that's so important, how to guard against making statements that are additionally cutting and hurtful?
I wish I did. You hear about this all the time. And let me give you in my own personal experience, the classic example in our family. When I died, my father was 19, so my older brother was 25, and my oldest brother was 25. And he and his friends, they would have been described as hippies, right? And with everything that came along with that. And when my father was in his bedroom and looking out the window, he was only sick for 4.5 months with the cancer and diagnosed. And he looked out the window and he saw that my brother drove up to the house with some friends to, come see him. And he said, look, Rabbi and his friends, they're so generous with each other. They're sitting in the car. They only have one cigarette between them and they're passing it around. That's so nice. So that's the kind of crowd. So my brother's friend, I'm not going to say her name because she's still very much alive, though not in this community. None of you would know her. My brother's friend sent my mother a condolence. She lived out of the country. Sent my mother a condolence card. And it said, this is after my father. My father was 55 years old. My mother was 52. She was widowed, right? After a 4.5-month illness. And this young woman, who was probably about 23 years old, sends my mother a card. Endings are beginnings. Congratulations on your new beginning. Her dying day, my mother never forgave her. I don't blame my mother for that, by the way. So this is an extreme example of what you're talking about, right? And people say this stuff and they do mean well. And I don't have an answer for you. I wish I did. I try not to do it myself. And sometimes even in that, as you know, even in that I fail.
New York Times has an article, at least online, precisely what not to say.
Yeah, recently I saw it. Yeah, right. So, but it's, you have to, for me, you try and look at that and say, okay, they meant well. It was completely stupid. I'm not going to be hurt by it because it was a stupid thing for them to say, and just move on. What I don't do is give that person attention. If they come to a Shiva house, I find somebody else to go talk to. But yes, and then I got some other things I want to get to. and then we're gonna
I'm
get,
stuck on this poem, to be honest.
yeah.
So, usually, what do you do with these people? Your children or anybody that relates. Okay, you want the past, you want the present to be in the past, but. So what's the solution?
I don't think there's a solution. I think you just have to acknowledge the feelings that this evokes. And that we all get caught up in that reality sometimes and just acknowledge it and live with it. I mean, I think one of the ways we integrate the pain of grief into who we are is by feeling it and living with it and let it sometimes wash over us and kind of take over temporarily. Right? And I mean, I don't think there's a solution. It's always gonna be like that. And so, I know that, in regard to the death of my loved ones, there are moments when I said this before, where I can get caught up and feel the intensity of it all over again. It's just that that's not my reality all the time, right? If that's your reality all the time, after a year or so, then that's when you actually should seek, some counsel to just help you figure out why. Okay, let me just go 2 or 3 more minutes. We didn't get quite as far as I thought we would. We never do. From John Gunther, who wrote Death Be Not Proud, which was, John Gunther was a journalist and an author, and I forget how old his son was when he died, but his son had, I forget what disease, but his son died. And he wrote a book called Death Be Not Proud. I mean, a lot of us read it in high school. And this is what he wrote. The influence, maybe this is my answer to your question. The influence, the impact of a person continues to exert itself long after mortal bonds have broken. Not only, and he wrote this for his son, so I'm going to read it the way he wrote it. Not only that he lives in our hearts or in anything he truly touched, but that a person transmits permanently something of what he was to all of us. The fabric of the universe is continuous and eternal. So maybe that's Joshua Loth Liebman, who is a rabbi whose name may mean something to some of you. He was a conservative rabbi. He wrote a book in the 1950s called Peace of Mind. He was the Harold Kushner of his time. Was he? No, he was not. He was older than Michael. They wouldn't have been contemporaries. And Joshua Loth Liebman, who was a wonderful, sensitive rabbi in New York, himself died, I think, at age 46 maybe it was 51 or something. He was young. Died of, I think he had a massive coronary. There's only 2 kinds of heart attacks. He had a small heart attack. He had a massive heart attack. So by the way, you can still get copies of Peace of Mind. I think it's out of print, but there's copies floating around. I wouldn't be surprised if the library has one. It is worth reading. And it has to do with coping with challenges in our lives, including grief and illness and so on. He himself was not such a well man. And it holds, I mean, it's dated in certain ways, but it still holds up. I have a copy of it that was given to my grandfather, who I'm named for, who died before I was born, was given to my grandfather from his cousin after my grandfather's first heart attack. And I think he was in his 50s at the time. And they gave him this book. It was he lived from that one, but he died, right? Judaism teaches us to understand death as part of the divine pattern of the universe. Actually, we could not have our sensitivity without fragility. Mortality is the price we pay for the privilege of love, thought, creative work. The toll on the bridge of being, from which clods of earth and snow-peaked mountain summits are exempt. Just because we are human, we are prisoners of the years. Yet that very prison is the room of discipline in which we, driven by the urgency of time, create. When we die, those who have been touched and illumined by the flame of our being should rejoice to think of us with joyous reminiscence. It's a beautiful passage from in the midst of the book. All right, we are past, but we're about 4 minutes after 10. I'm told to respect the clock. Any other final closing comments?
So, yeah,
Yes.
this was a
Right, hang on one
class.
second, with that person next to you.
Just want to thank you for the shortest handout ever.
Happy to do it.
This was a class that was beyond phenomenal.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. That's good. Thank, that's